we've assembled a wonderful panel here. The title of the panel is UX Research Methods, Challenges, and Practices. So I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then if you all want to say something more about yourself, feel free to afterwards when you start talking. Directly next to me, I have Celia Hodent. She's a games UX consultant in the United States, and there's so much more about Celia to learn. So feel free to hit her up after the presentation here. And then Mia, I have your last name spelled phonetically here. Lahteenmaki.
Lahteenmaki.
I was very close. All right. So Mia is a user researcher at Rovio, and there's a lot more to know about her as well in Finland. And
I love your introductions, that's right.
Yes. Well, we have very little time. Well, the timer's not moving, so apparently we have unlimited time. Yeah, we got free time right now. Jason Schklar and
Schklar.
I blame Timo for that. I asked him about that right before. Interesting enough, you probably wrote an email, UX design and product consultant in UX is fine, but that's actually the title they put on the conference presentation. So your new title is product consultant and UX is fine. So that's a much better title.
Happy to talk about it after the...
And once again, like everybody else on this panel, very rich history all the way back to the early days at Microsoft. And of course, Seb Long, no problems pronouncing your last name, Seb. Most of you know Seb. You probably saw him earlier today in a really good talk. He's a games UX researcher at Player Research, and then he's much more than that. He pretty much runs the show there in Brighton and Montreal. So just want a little round of applause for bringing these people from all over the world. So thank you, guys. So one of the things I wanted to do with this panel is just keep it more, actually things that we could take away and stay a little bit away from the high-level stuff that we typically get at conferences, and just have a little chat about some of the issues that we have with methods, some of the challenges we have with methods in the game industry. So Celia, it's a wonderful person to start the conversation. One of the big ones that I always ask about is how do we actually do behavioral observation? That's a really challenging method. So.
Nah, it's easy. Yeah, it's really the thing that I prefer to do. So I've been doing research at Ubisoft, LucasArts, and Epic Games. What I mainly do is UX strategy, but of course, playtest is a big part of it. And so when we do playtests to verify our assumptions and to check what the players are doing and feeling and what they understand, what I love to do is going back to the basic and just place the players in front of situation, a task, or just the game, depending on how far we are in the development process, and just watch what they're doing and what they're not doing, the challenges they encounter, and the hesitations, and any of these things. So to do that, it's the preparation is very important. So first, we're gonna probably talk about that later, but first you need to have hypotheses that you're gonna work with, because you need to know what you're looking for. So you work with the developers to know what they're trying to find out. And based on these hypotheses, you're gonna decide what type of protocol you're gonna do. Is it gonna be a task analysis? For example, you're gonna ask people to do a certain thing, like say in Fortnite, hey, look at this prototype, and I'm gonna ask you to try to craft a sword or whatever. And we look at how much time players are gonna do that, and the errors, the mistakes they're doing, and do they understand it fast or not. Or we can say, hey, we're just gonna do a walkthrough test, and we just like put the players in front of the game and we don't say anything and we see what happens. So depending on what we're looking for, we're gonna have a different protocol, and we prepare, you have observators for the test, and we prepare with them, the researcher prepares with them a grid, an observation grid. So we already know what we're going to look for, because observing people, it's very difficult. It's draining, and it's asking a lot of attentional resources. It's hard to observe people for hours. And so we need to have a grid. So we already know, like, for example, in this situation, did players use whatever abilities? Did they manage to do whatever action? And so we're already prepared to know what's going to happen. And so we can code yes, no, or like mistake or not mistake, blah, blah, blah. And so that's really helping to figure out what's going to happen, and later on how to analyze these things. So that's the main thing to know, and to make sure that you're not biasing yourself. Sticking to the protocol is really important. Sticking to what exactly you're gonna measure, sticking to your observation grid is going to be really important, because you also tape what's going on. So then if the observators are hesitant, they can go back later on to re-observe what happened to make sure that they did not code something differently, and you want to make sure that you're not making any inferences. Like, for example, if a player takes some time into making an action, you're gonna, in your observation sheet, you're gonna say, took time to make whatever action. You're not gonna say, did not understand it, or was frustrated into doing it. Already you're making an inference based off what you believe what's happening in the mind of the player. You have to stick to the facts, and then later on, with what players answer to surveys, and deeper analysis, you can try to find out why they took time to do whatever actions. So this is what I like to do, and when we do surveys, I also like to have surveys that ask players about very concrete elements. So typically we don't ask stuff like, oh, did you find the interface intuitive? Most players are going to say yes. What you're going to ask is, oh, look at this icon. What do you think that means? Or look at this thing. Look at the HUD. What's happening right now in the game? So you take screenshots. You show players a screenshot, and you ask them, what is this? What is that? What was your objective in the past mission, etc. You ask for very concrete elements so that you can find out if players understood or not what was going on. That's basically it.
Oh, that's
easy,
quite a bit.
Right?
Yeah, very easy. So questions about behavioral observation from many folks here. Yeah, go for it, Seb.
Hi, thanks, Celia. I wondered if, when you're observing a player in a playtest, what kind of questions you're asking yourself. So not just the questions you're asking the player, but what questions are you asking yourself while you're watching this person in play? Are there any good ones?
Yeah, but that's the thing I was mentioning earlier. We have hypotheses that we're working with. We typically, for example, if we're testing the new system, like the crafting system, or we just redid the UI for the crafting system, well, I know that this is something we're going to look for. And so whenever the player's in a situation when they want to craft something, we want to make sure that at some point they want to craft something. So during the playtest, we make sure that this is going to happen if it's not initially natural. We prepare for that, and we prepare into the different options that can happen. So that's the sort of questions we ask ourselves. And also, what I like to do is I like to stay behind the one-way mirror with the developers and ask them to come down. And I ask myself, how are they going to react? And I ask them questions like, all right, like, see what's happening. So what did you use that thing, or why is this element that color, or what do you use that metaphor to express these things? So I can tell, what we're trying to express, and if we can find out a way to make that better, because obviously it's not working. And it's really, for me, it's really the part that I love, is to look at the reactions from the developers and build up from that.
And I think in terms of effectiveness of communicating and working with a team, your strategy is great too, because involving them in the thought process gets them bought in, excuse me, that we're all in it together trying to solve this question. It's not really about like how good or bad your game is, it's how do we fix things that we see or observe, and we're working as a team. So I really like your comment on that.
So how many user researchers do you typically have in the test? Like, do you have several observers, or are you using game team members as observers?
Yes, so unless we're doing a one-on-one protocol, so for example, if we do I think a lot of protocol, it's typically we have one researcher that's going to take care of everybody because it's one after the other. But when we can actually have in parallel several players, they're going to do some walkthroughs. Typically, you have one researcher for what I've been doing in the past, one researcher for the project, but then you have several observers that are in the pit with the players, whereas the researcher is behind with the developers to ask these kind of questions. For the observers, it's not ideal, but so far what I've been doing is having one observer for 2 people, knowing that it's already biased because it's really hard. We can't multitask. So the observers are looking at something, writing down something else, and have to look at several people. So it works somehow because usually players are not doing exactly the same thing at the same time. So if you're saying someone in the menu, like you don't care about the menu right now, and the other player is doing something more important for your test, then again, they can focus on that. But ideally, you want to have one person watching one player, but usually we don't have enough resources to do that.
Celia, when you write up the results using behavioral observation, do you actually have a section in your report that just says behavioral observation, or do you blend it in with the other findings and mix it with other data?
Well, usually in the report it's really like 99% are all observation based off what happened in the test. And it's rare that when it's not happening, and when it's just us anticipating problems that we actually did not see in the test, we would say like we anticipate that this could be a problem. We're not mentioning that players have a problem with it. Sometimes we do suggestions, so you have a different entry for that. But most of the time, the reports from playtests are based off observation because that's the point. Gotcha. Sometimes we do heuristic analysis, or heuristic evaluation, which is UX experts looking at the game at one instant and then making some observations on it and anticipating the problems, but that's a different thing.
No. Yeah.
And you hit on the something that you talked about in your talk this morning too, the causes, like making sure everyone is understanding the causes, and I think that is sort of essential too. So it's, you know, when your report is kind of objective and focused on the data, then it's all about, you know, okay, we know what's happened and we've observed it. Now we can start to guess about what some of the causes are, and we can, again, work together as a team and make sure we come up with a consensus. So that approach is really effective. Like if you're trying to be more influential with your teams, do more working with them to understand the causes as opposed to providing suggestions early on. Sometimes your suggestions, I found in the past that if you're not as close to the project or you haven't been on it as long, which often in the UX capacity you're not, or especially if you're monitoring several titles, you just don't have the depth of knowledge, and you don't know what they tried maybe a month ago and maybe what you're suggesting they actually tried and it didn't work, or what have you. So really just focusing less on the, like, here's what you should do and here's how you should fix things, and more on the what did we see, what do we believe is a problem, and what do we think the causes are so you can address it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other thoughts from the panel? We're going to open up the questions at the end, and you can come back to behavioral observation, but any other thoughts or advice on behavioral observation? No?
I'm wondering in practice that who would be your ideal observers, because on a one.
Not me, I can tell you that. I'm terrible at it. I don't know. I might have ADHD or something. It's hard for me to focus a long time. So it has to be people who can focus a long time on watching players. It's really hard, and people who are not jumping to conclusions. So they have an analytical mind and can focus on watching players as in the least biased way possible. That's the ideal observer.
There's reasonably good data on who games user researchers are, like the people, what their backgrounds and so forth, and more than 80% of them have a bachelor's in psychology or higher. So 60% have a master's or a PhD, and it's in those psychology-related domains mostly, so cognitive science, neuroscience. So HCI, that's my background, or similar brain kind of focused research backgrounds. So above 80% of the people doing our work have that background.
Yeah, in general, people who have had some training in school about how to observe, how to do it correctly, how not to get involved, and be the anthropologist for the day. So
researcher. Research background. Yeah.
So there's a lot of other topics we could discuss, but one of the things that came up was just in general demographics, motivation, which are, yeah, me, keep the mic, man, it's coming to you. But there's a, I mean, what could we, how could we help people understand those areas more? So.
Okay, so let's go now to a little bit other research type. So typically when game teams want to do a game or you want to start a project, you need to be able to define your target audience, who the game is for. And marketing wants to know who are your players. And of course, in order to be able to develop a good game, you need that understanding too. And the first thing that is often asked is like demographics. What's their age? What's their gender? And several kinds of marketing survey questions. From the UX perspective, they are demographics. They are describing the players. A little bit from marketing perspective, who they are. And if you want to go into details of how to study that, of course, you can do a survey. You can put age brackets, 0 to 18, 19 to 29. What is the age? Then there's a gender issue. It's currently a touchy topic, so within a few years, it's become a topic where I suggest that if you are going to ask about gender, Google and Google well, and do it in your target culture. One way to go maybe around it is to ask for sex, which is more a biological construct, and thus you can survive with maybe female, male, transgender, other, and prefer not to say. But most important is, of course, this prefer not to say, so that people can also opt in for not telling details. And of course, all in this kind of demographic questions and surveys, we have to consider all the privacy laws in place in the target countries. But then we come to the question why. Also, our privacy laws now request us that why do we need this information? And I would a little bit challenge that from the development perspective, from the game development perspective, we don't necessarily need it. It might even work counterproductively, not only in games industry, but in other high-tech companies also, because if the target audience, target player is not similar target to you, for example, if I'm developing a game for a 15 years old male, I might have quite strong stereotypes about that type of person because it's not me, it's not my life, and that's what tends to happen. Similarly, if you are a young developer and you're developing a game for a female 40 years old, that might be something that drives you into thinking of stereotypes. And when we are thinking of stereotypes, we are categorizing people, and it's not striving innovation or doing very good in terms of creating an interesting game. So what kind of data then would help in the game development? I find that game teams tend to take interest in the data, like what kind of games people like to play, the target audience. They typically have their own suggestions, and we study if that is true. Then there is the type of games, the game genre, which in the mobile games is more and more mixed. So it's not straightforward to ask only about game genre. Then there is the motivations. So there is a very good work from Nick Yee in Quantic Foundry about gaming motivations. And that's a very good starting point of thinking of the of the motivations of your player, and you can actually do the survey there to find out your own motivational profile as a gamer too. Yeah. So I ended up from demographics to not doing demographics, but actually getting a little bit deeper into what kind of games people play and motivations.
Just to follow up on that, I have sort of interesting anecdotal stories about, so a lot of people come in with gender and then you train them, like it's not gender, it's just people who play your game. Let's bring in people who play your game. And then someone comes in and she or he doesn't look like the stereotypical person that they have in mind. And it's great when I'm doing an observational study because I'll detect that that's happening. And then when I'm warming them up or after the session, I'll start talking to them. Hey, it looks like you said you played a whole bunch of Call of Duty. Just like, oh yeah, I'm in this guild. I play probably like 3 nights a week. And I'm sort of like kind of nodding to the people in the observation room, like saying like, I know you guys don't think she's a gamer, but she's a gamer, right? Often, unfortunately, it's usually with the female, but sometimes it'll happen, he doesn't look like a casual gamer. He's too young and male and, looks like he wants to play aggro games and stuff like that. But it's really useful to have that data and then just really reinforce to the team that these are your target market, and you need to drop your stereotypes. If you want to build games that they love, you need to test with the people who love these kinds of games.
Yep. Yeah, one of the things we talked about at lunch was when you're given all these requests on what you're supposed to have in your study, how do we prioritize those, and display those to the teams in the way that we think is going to be the most impactful, so they can actually take things away and have those lessons learned. Because sometimes if we present by age, and let's say we have 18 to 50-year-olds in our study, there's nothing going on there. They might think, well, it's for all ages. We're like, well, maybe it's just age doesn't actually measure anything, and it's really about the types of games they play. So one of the challenging things that I find is that we often present our results in 2D. It's on Microsoft Word, and you can't actually go and sort things and look at data different ways. So we sometimes have to choose in which way do we present this data. And I think when we talked earlier about this, we were all like, it's really the games they play is the most important part. And then everything else is, not so important, although we do collect it. So, it related to, behavioral observation and demographics. Everything has to be asked either verbally, observed, quantified, objectified, something. But not everything. But some of it's just pure qualitative data. But scales is a really important thing, and that's a really tricky one to get into. And I know, Jason, you have a lot of knowledge about scales, I think.
Hi. Actually, just sort of riffing off and then coming over to mine, the whole idea of face validity is important. What we mean by face validity is that on its face, you should be able to look at a set of data or a set of constraints and say, yeah, I totally believe that this is realistic and represents what I'm looking for. And so sometimes the gender thing or the age thing is more about, if you're going to have 10 participants, make sure you have a nice cross-section of people who generally fit into the demographics that you'd expect. And that's face valid, right? If you bring in all of one type or all of a different type or a bunch of people who don't look like, or don't age or play the right games, then it's not going to have face validity, and people aren't going to believe your results, and you shouldn't probably believe your own results. When it comes to actually reporting the hard data, though, when I was doing user research back in the Microsoft days, we did a lot of survey research. And what we found, there was a lot of debate. We had a bunch of burnt out graduate students who left before their PhDs, but we all thought we were super knowledgeable about how scales were constructed and how response items were constructed. And you need to have these nice 1 to 7 scales, potentially, of not at all to like totally always, because they're better in terms of some types of measurement, and they're more sensitive to variation. You can observe. You're more likely to observe a variation when it exists. But the thing is that teams don't understand what a mean of 5.4 is, right? But they do understand something like when you ask, how hard is your game? Too hard, too easy, or about right. You kind of know that you want most of your people to say about right. And so even though for longer term studies with a program of research, you might want to use more Likert scale variables, the 1 to 7 variables for statistical reasons, sometimes if you're not particularly doing that, trying to get simpler and more face valid response sets will be super helpful. And then related to that is once they start to see numbers, some people they love numbers, but they're not great consumers of numerical data. So for instance, when we run usability studies, oftentimes we'll report the number of participants who committed a certain error. Maybe we ran 9 participants and we say 4 of 9 people experienced this. Actually, let's just say 4 of 10 for the sake of math in my head. And some people will be like, oh, 40%, well, the problem is that when you only have 10 people, 4 out of 10 actually isn't 40%. I mean, it truly could range between probably 2 and 8. It's, you don't exactly know. So actually taking a percentage and thinking about it is a problem. The other problem is when you actually have quantitative data where you feel comfortable giving percentages, like say you have 25 or 30 people fill out a survey and you take the average response, you get a percentage, then they'll think that it's like a grade. So it's, it's like, hey, 84% said very fun, so we're like an A- or whatever. And actually the grade has nothing to do with it that way. What you do when you're trying to do this kind of analysis, how am I performing compared to other competitors, is you need to see where that 84 falls in with your other competitors. Because for instance, like an 84 in one genre might be the same as a 71 in another genre. And it just happens that genre is just harder for us to study. We get a lot more noise, and so we just tend to get lower scores. But we know, consistently that these games are in the 70s, even the top ones that are doing well. And so really you can't, it's this fallacy of like what numbers mean. You have to really own that, and if you're not really strong in that, you've got to be very careful in the way you present numbers to your consumers, to the people using the data.
Yeah, I had a lot of conversations over the years with my friends who have worked at Microsoft, and one of the things that they mentioned, I want to know if it's true, they would have these debates about the numbers increasing or decreasing by 0.1. And they would say, why did this happen? Because oftentimes they would play test a product 30 or 40 times over the course of its life cycle.
So interestingly, I worked with Zynga, where we actually had population data, and we had millions of players. So a 0.1 difference in that context actually is meaningful because it's telling you real results. And that has meaningful impact on the health of the product, how much monetization you're doing and stuff like that. When you're doing survey research where, we know about, we might not know about margin of error, but we know that measurement, it contains various types of error, is just that, yeah, you can't just, I need more context, but yes, if they were confident that a 0.1 difference was significant because of some significance testing, I would want to just see the underlying data and make sure that I actually believed it too.
Yeah.
I think we've all talked a little bit about methods. And it's clear that the challenges aren't just in the methods themselves, capturing the data, but also in communicating it back to the team. That is a challenge unto itself, to be persuasive in the data you're communicating. I wondered if either of you three had examples of actions you've taken to be more persuasive with the data in terms of persuading the team an action needs to be taken.
Well, the kind of obvious and straightforward ones are to provide video clips of the playtesting parts that were problematic, and of course also the parts that raise very good response, because those are very energizing to the team. So I find that's very good. And of course, like Celia was telling about the observations, bringing team to look at the players who are playing the game, talking about the game, are actual players of the game. I think that always makes an effect.
Yeah, same thing, like video clips. It's really a good way to share, look, they're not getting it.
Sometimes I have to de-emphasize the data. If it's a 3.5 versus a 3.6 with, let's say, or I'll give it even a bit more, 3.3 versus a 3.6 on a 5-point scale. They'll ask, well, the 3.6 is clearly the winner. I'm like, well, no, there's actually no difference between those two at all. So I actually try to bring in something that might be a little bit more digestible, especially for math people who are in development, like the developers in the game industry, and just say, I'm going to teach you about effect size. Like, what is the actual effect? What's the main effect? What's the real effect between these two scores? And then I can show them there's absolutely no difference between these two, even though one score is higher than the other, because of what Jason said, all the error that might come in.
But I would argue that why show the data then? I mean, this is more for the researcher. The researcher is going to gather a bunch of data that they're going to understand because they understand the context, they understand the science behind it, they understand statistics. But then they're going to provide some insights back to the team. They don't necessarily need to show, oh, they're like 3 out of 5 people did that. We don't really care. The team doesn't need to know that. They need to understand what works, what didn't work, and how to fix it.
I guess that comes back to the value of the research background that your staff have, ideally, is that they're understanding, they can get these root causes and understand that maybe just one player in 6 having this small behavior can actually mean a monstrous impact on the wider development. So knowledge of the product, knowledge of that human psychology to assess that player behavior and really work out where those high value individual instances and behaviors are.
Yeah. Now, methods. We like to think there's only 2, maybe in UX. Maybe that's not true. It's not just usability and play testing. Usability, we have small groups of people perhaps coming in, give you feedback about your product, or what we often think of as play testing, which is larger groups of people. We've had a couple of good discussions that there's a lot of other methods that we can actually employ. And oftentimes, UX teams don't employ the other methods. But Seb, if you could give us a...
Sure. Some of them have been mentioned already, but our job, our role is to help you, the team, make better decisions, make better creative decisions throughout the whole process. And that really shouldn't begin once we've made a load of decisions already and we have a working build. So to start with usability testing is to have missed myriad opportunities to improve the product, right? And this whole discipline that we're all in, UX, has grown out of that need to make better choices as early as possible in the development process. So there are very many methods. In fact, Celia's already mentioned one, the idea of a heuristic review. A heuristic is like a rule of thumb for design, like a reason that things commonly go wrong. There are other ways to get data that you could be using much, much earlier in your development processes. Starting off actually right at day 0 when you could be doing, looking at your competitor games in a structured way, and speaking more to players. Mia mentioned this idea of speaking to your players and asking what motivates them and why they might play your game versus other people's games. That can begin as soon as you have an idea, as soon as you have a genre in mind. We're going to make, I don't know, the next Angry Birds or something. You can find out why people love those games, why people play those games, what they've bought in those games, why did they enjoy it. You can have so much rich information can be generated by talking to those players that can be rolled into your design process. And that begins before you've written a single line of code. That could be called a persona generation project. A persona is like a prototypical player, an imaginary player, but based in real data. You might describe maybe you would describe their demographic information, but you'd probably be much more focused on their motivations. Why does this person pick up games? Why do they put down games? And we can actually design for that person. Again, that begins really early. That's a whole UX process that games hasn't really embraced. We talked about heuristic review as well. There are many heuristic sets out there. Again, a heuristic is like a rule of thumb, a formalized written rule that you could kind of use as a lens on your game. I'm going to struggle to come up with anything on the spot. But visibility of system status is like a super common one from Nielsen's heuristics. Can the player at all times tell what's going on in the game? What statuses are there in the game? I'm nearly dead. I'm superpowered. I've got my ultimate ability. We can start to take those heuristics and actually use them in the design process to design better games. So yeah, go ahead and research some of those heuristics. If we think, if I were to cover them as kind of the pre-design or during design UX methods, there's a whole load after playtesting too. So after you've done the usability tests and you've got really good learnability and usability in your game, and you've done your large lab playtests or your UX playtests, and you've got kind of good balancing, maybe you've tested the maps and make sure there's no exploits and things like that. There's a whole load of methods to explore long-term retention. To really understand how the game feels to play after a week, after 2 weeks, after a month. Not just analytics that describes what players did, but UX methods that described why they did that, why players did that, and how they felt about it. If you're interested in this topic, you should be Googling for something called a play diary or a longitudinal study, where you give players a diary to fill out. Maybe every day, maybe every time they play, maybe every day they don't play, so that you can learn about players over time. A diary might last 6 to 8 weeks. And you're going to be learning about things that you can't test in a usability test. For example, the session length. How long does it take to play your game? You kind of know that from the analytics, I guess, but do players have enough time to fit your game in their day? Like, does that change depending on the region that you're in? Maybe more people have more free time in certain places than others. Maybe you could tweak your game to fit them better. You could only determine that by marrying what players did and why they did it and how they felt about it in something like a longitudinal study. So if you're interested in UX, and I guess you are because you're here, there are very many methods you could be using to better understand your players, make better design choices, and to improve your game in very many ways.
Any comments on paper and pencil prototyping?
Whew, okay.
Yes.
So paper prototyping is a bit like a heuristic analysis in that it's done very, very early during the design process, but you're using real players. So in a usability playtest, which is similar, you would invite real members of the general public to your studio, or ideally you've got a research lab or something, and you would put the game in front of those players and ask them just to either complete a task or play as they normally would, and you observe them play, and you determine whether or not that meets your success criteria, I guess, or whatever you deem success in your individual, in the game. And that can begin really early. In fact, it can begin before it's even interactive. It can begin on paper with those wireframes you're producing, with maybe the clickables you've got, or whatever the artists are doing to kind of mock up the aesthetics of the UI. Just as simple as just putting down a sheet of paper in front of a player and giving them a task. Tell me where you'd tap if you were to wanting to join a multiplayer game. And you'd ask the player to look at the screen and make that interaction. This has cost almost nothing. It's cost nothing except a piece of paper and your time for the day, but can fundamentally improve the UI long before it's cooked into code. So again, another method for early pre-design, pre-code improvement of the UX of the game.
Jason, you want to share your story about paper and pencil prototyping? I don't know. Flying game?
Pardon me?
Crimson Skies?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, for me, the sort of gold standard is being able to drive UX and UX research deep enough into your process that you're able to test early on actual code and actual builds that are going to be somewhat representative, and that you've allotted yourself time and you have production methodology to support rapid iteration in response to what you see. So that's the ideal, but sometimes you just run out of time. And so with Crimson Skies, that was the one you're talking about. We were just like at the end of the life cycle, and it's like, well, Xbox Live is coming out. We need to have a multiplayer lobby. Okay, so the UI artist just mocked up a whole stack of papers, and I just played the role of computer. So I'm just like, I'd give them the task, and then they'd tell me they would tell me with a stick where they would navigate over to and what button they would press, and then I would just act as the computer. And it took until Halo 2 to really solve matchmaking. I don't think we made any great leaps based on it, but we certainly solved for some obvious gotchas and things that would have been terrible to have experienced as a player. So it's definitely useful, even especially when you just don't have time for anything else.
Any other comments on other methods before we open it up for questions? We're going to open it up for questions now, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll get a mic over to you. Any questions at all? Yes. Out? No? No? We'll go over here first. Same team members, different sides of the room.
So is there a time when data is lying? People fill in surveys but it's like always this notion that maybe customers don't know what they want, and you have to build what they don't want. And if you fill in survey, they'll just answer what they think they want, but that might not be the real case.
So I think Celia wants this one.
Yeah, data is not lying, but humans are biased. And data can be polluted by for example, if you're looking at analytics and how many players are finishing the tutorial level, and you find out, there's 80% of players who finish the tutorial level, it's awesome. But then in the data, the problem is if they quit instead of quitting out from the UI, but they just do Alt F4, whatever. imagine that it's not registering as they quit the game during the tutorial. Then you don't account for that. And you have among your 80% of people that would finish the tutorial, actually there's only 60%. So the data can be polluted by a bunch of stuff. Maybe there's the hooks have problems, stuff is not firing, so you need to QA the shit out of that stuff. But then the data is not information. Once you get the data, you need to get information out of it, and this is the difficult part. And this is where data is not lying. It's just like we are terrible at understanding complex elements, and we are biased. So that's the part that's hard. So that's why you need data analysts and scientists. If you're not comfortable, don't try to do it yourself. Like, let the professionals do it, because otherwise you can have problems.
We have another question.
I could continue that it's also a lot about the questions, like do people understand the questions correctly? Is the survey done so that you just click through them all at the one, like, you know, that it's easiest to answer always yes, 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 10, 10, 10 to everything. So there's a lot to also design in the actual study to make it count.
Or reading questions.
Yeah.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, hi. My question is around hypothesis. What makes a good hypothesis? And in particular, at the very beginning of a project where all the options are available, we're designing a completely new game, we have millions of questions. How do I write a good hypothesis that I can actually learn something from?
So this is the hard part, actually. But you concentrate on the experience you want to offer and what audience you want to offer. So an example, very early on, when I was working on 1313, it was like, you know, kind of Uncharted game, but Star Wars universe, and so it was in console game. So we needed to make sure that the controls are going to be comfortable. So one of the first hypotheses is what would be the default settings for sensitivity of the controller that would make sense for our audience. So that would be that sort of hypothesis. Like, if the sensitive is not good, then people are not going to be comfortable and they might quit the game. Knowing that most people don't change the settings, it's only power users that are going to change the sensitivity in the settings, you want that to be good by default. So based off of that, we build a gym level where there's just like targets popping, and we ask players to hit the targets as fast as possible. So you can see if are they overshooting, or they're just stopping right before hitting the target, and we can measure that sort of thing. So that's the early stuff you can do, more around game feel, more around understanding of the game based on what type of game it is. It's an action game, platform game, so you're gonna focus on the things that are core to the experience you want to offer. Does that make sense? And then the further down you go, then you can figure out, like Fortnite, building is a very important core element in the game. So my hypothesis is if players don't understand quickly enough how to build efficiently, then they're going to churn because they're going to be frustrated at some point. So, but then we can test that a bit later on in the process.
How would you test that?
Oh, you just watch players, and it's very easy. Like when we were testing the first stuff in Plate and Fortnite, we were seeing players, they were able to build walls, but for example, to protect an objective, they would just build a wall around, you know, the objective, and then they will wall themselves in, and they were like, oh shit, what do I do now? And so they did not know how to edit a door, for example, and so they were destroying one of the walls to get out. So we could tell very early on that building a wall is not too complicated, but then building efficiently and knowing how to use doors and windows is more complicated, and we are going to have to focus on that to teach that sort of things to players. It's not that complicated to test.
So you're telling me there are doors in Fortnite for those walls?
Yes! Oh no, Sean's like,
Yes. I've only got about 6,000 hours in that game, so. Jason.
Sorry. So yeah, I'm just blanking on the one thing that I was going to say. As far as testing, you know, for it, it's kind of neat that, like, what I feel like I do is I kind of become a dungeon master in some ways, and what you're thinking of is how do I get my player characters into situations where I can observe and test my hypotheses of interest. The ideal way to do it is to have a fully built out level that's reasonably realistic, and you can get the highest quality data from that. But as the dungeon master, sometimes you can use other little props and things to get the most out of a situation. You can't answer some questions with certainty, like how will they do it when the lighting is correct, or when we change the textures on these things or whatever, and you'll need to retest to validate. But you can still do that sort of stuff early on. And then the other part was, does anyone else want to jump in while I think about the other part? Sorry.
I had 2 good points.
Quickly, related to hypotheses, it's really important to come up with I think a really fleshed out hypothesis. And some people will, typically come up with a research question. It's just a question, but there's not much more to it. I usually like to say, give it some direction. Why do you think it's going to turn out this way? And Celia hit on it earlier, talking about the detail stuff in Fortnite. Usually we have expectations, and if we know those expectations, we can either look at it better, observe it better, measure it better, et cetera, and it's much easier. But then Jason hit on another topic too. We always retest these hypotheses. If you're early on and it's not fully fleshed out, you might be able to get some directional data, but you have to actually have that hypothesis come up several times again and just measure it again, retest. And then a lot of people would say test it with a different methodology as well.
I'm going to argue with you. I'm going to argue with all of you.
Well, you
Sorry.
have like 45 seconds
I'll go
to
quickly.
argue with us. So.
Stop thinking about hypotheses. Just design. But when you're designing, think about 3 key things. What do you want players to do? What is the behavior that you want from them? What do you want them to understand? What things about the game do they need to understand, and what's the mental model they have in their brain? And what do you want them to enjoy? With those 3 pieces of information separated out, a hypothesis can be, you've generated a hypothesis, you've generated the circumstance you think will be true if you put players in this thing. So don't worry about the measures, just capture those 2 things. What does this thing do? If it's successful, what do players do? What do they understand? And what do they enjoy, or what do they feel? And from that, you can test away.
Seb's the UX evangelist of our industry. So, we got no more time for any other questions. It's blinking red. Do we have time for another question?
5 more minutes.
Yeah, go on.
Sure.
Sneaky one.
Right here in the middle. Mike, right over here.
So, do you have any specifics or certain recommendations when you test different focus groups, specifically regions? Let's say you have ready prototype in Europe, ready prototype in Asia, and North American market. How do you approach different regions and different players? Do you have a certain methodology which is applied for all, or you approach them in a different way?
All right. Hot potato. Okay. I think this is underexplored specifically in games user experience. There are methodologies for understanding players' reactions to prototypes or whatever that are fundamentally about them as human beings. Like, we're looking at what they do and what they understand. That's about language, that's about our bodies, that's about neuroscience. In terms of the differences in cultures in terms of what they like and what players enjoy, that is, as far as I'm concerned, reasonably underexplored. But separating out those 3 can really help. I would suggest, and I'm not an expert in this, that between cultures there's reasonable consistency in what people are likely to enjoy, what their motivations are, what circumstances and scenarios they will enjoy, what designs they will enjoy. But in terms of how to communicate that, in terms of visual language, in terms of symbols and signs, in terms of colors, it can be very different, and that means testing in each of those 3 regions.
Yep. I found out my undergrad was in anthropology, and first thing I'll say to myself, I don't know other cultures. I don't know what they want or what they need. But usually our companies are very diverse, and we have these amazing people that work in these other areas around the world. And recently I got back from a trip from South Korea, and I thought I knew what South Korean gamers were like. And then I started talking to people that work in that office. I'm like, wow, they're very different than, like, they have different expectations, specifically related to things like purchasing, and buying power and things of that nature. It's almost like a little bit negative in this state. So I think by talking to the other regions and people who live in that culture, I can just learn so much, and then I can make sure that I don't ask questions from what we call ethnocentric, right? An ethnocentric point of view, where it's just my culture that's asking that question. And I think it's very dangerous for people in other cultures to put their stereotypes on someone else's culture. That's how everything goes wrong. And then we end up not even asking the right questions. So.
Yes, so that was actually my suggestion, because you were talking about focus groups specifically. So hire local moderator, local recruiter, who also know about the games. Those are critical.
Yes. Yeah, huge cultural differences. Other regions, at least in the United States, I don't think our participants are too respectful sometimes. They can destroy our research lab. I go to another culture and I mean, it's like they almost honored the researchers and the research lab. So I start to think, how does that influence the methodology now? If there's a lot of researcher participant interaction in a culture that has lots of respect, is that somehow influencing my results versus, maybe in a focus group that I might run in the United States, they really don't like me and they're going to argue with everything I say, and they just want their Mountain Dew and get out of there fast as possible. So I think, yeah, ask people who live in those other cultures before, and hopefully they're a psychologist or a trained researcher, and we can get them to the team from another culture. Do we have any more time, or are we totally we're above? Okay. Well, thank you to all of our panelists here and all the folks that came and attended today. Thank you so much.